All right, so get this. What if I told you that catching COVID could be like aging your brain by 4 years?
Whoa.
Yeah, that's kind of the startling claim in this SciTech Daily article that we're diving into today. It's called Researchers Uncover a Startling Link Between COVID-19 and Alzheimer's Biomarkers.
Mm-hmm.
And it was published just a few days ago, February 6th, 2025. And let me tell you, it's a real head-scratcher.
Yeah, it definitely caught my eye as well. You know, we're all still grappling with the long-term impacts of COVID-19.
Right.
And this research really throws brain health into the mix
Yes.
in a way I hadn't considered before.
Right, like 4 years of brain aging, that's not just a statistic.
Right.
It's a potential shift in someone's life trajectory.
Yeah.
But before we get too carried away, I got to ask, what exactly are these amyloid biomarkers they keep mentioning?
Yeah.
I understand they're like warning signs, but warning signs for what specifically?
Okay, so imagine your brain as a superhighway with information zipping along different routes. Amyloid, a protein we all have, is kind of like the pavement. And in Alzheimer's, a wonky version of this protein called beta amyloid starts piling up like roadblocks. And these amyloid biomarkers in the blood are like traffic reports.
Oh.
They tell us how bad those blockages are getting.
So more of these biomarkers means more roadblocks and therefore more potential for problems down the line.
Exactly. And what's wild is that this study found that folks who'd had COVID showed an increase in these biomarkers similar to what you'd see with a known genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's called APOE4.
Whoa, okay, that's putting it into perspective big time.
Yeah.
So even if you don't have the genetic predisposition,
Right.
COVID could be messing with the same brain process.
Mm-hmm. That seems to be the implication, yeah. The study itself looked at over 1,200 people aged 46 to 80.
Okay.
They analyzed blood biomarkers before and after COVID infection and compared those to a control group who hadn't been infected.
And the researchers were specifically looking at changes in those amyloid biomarkers after infection.
Precisely. And they found that the magnitude of change after COVID was comparable to the effect of that APOE4 gene.
Wow.
Which is a huge red flag, even if this study can't definitively say that COVID causes Alzheimer's.
Yeah, that's a scary thought that catching a virus could potentially kickstart this whole process.
Yeah. Were there certain groups who seemed particularly vulnerable in the study? There were. The effect was strongest in older individuals, folks who had been hospitalized with severe COVID, and those who already had health issues like hypertension or high blood pressure.
So basically, if you're older, had a rough go with COVID, and have other health concerns, this news is especially concerning. It's almost like a recipe for trouble.
It's a combination that definitely warrants further investigation, but we have to remember this is an observational study.
Yeah.
Meaning it's showing us a connection, not proving cause and effect.
Right, right.
There could be other factors at play that we haven't fully grasped yet.
Right, right. Correlation doesn't equal causation.
Right.
But even so, the potential link is enough to make anyone pause and think.
Absolutely. And it raises another important question. Is this something unique to COVID, or could other infections also be affecting the brain in ways we don't fully understand?
Oh, man, that thought I hadn't even considered.
Right.
Is there research looking into that?
There is, and it's getting more attention all the time. For example, there's growing evidence that viruses like herpes and influenza, and even some chronic bacterial infections might be linked to an increased risk of conditions like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's.
Wow. So it's not just COVID we should be thinking about. This could be a much bigger conversation about infections and brain health in general.
Exactly. And one of the leading theories is that inflammation is the culprit.
Okay.
When your body fights off an infection, it triggers an inflammatory response, which can sometimes affect the brain.
Okay, so walk me through this. We get infected, our bodies fight back, and this inflammation could be messing with our brains even if we don't realize it?
That's the idea. And that inflammation might be what's driving those changes we see in the amyloid biomarkers after COVID infection.
Hold on, this is getting a little deep for me. Can we break down exactly how inflammation might be affecting those roadblocks in the brain we talked about?
Sure, think of it this way. When there's inflammation in the brain, it's like a construction zone popping up on that highway we talked about earlier.
Right.
This can disrupt the smooth flow of traffic and even damage the roads themselves, making it harder for information to get where it needs to go.
So even if you don't feel sick anymore, that past inflammation could be having a lasting impact.
It is, yeah, and it makes you wonder about all the things that might be contributing to brain inflammation without us even realizing it. It's not just about fighting off a cold or the flu.
Right. You're right. We talk a lot about things like diet and exercise for brain health. But what about chronic inflammation from things like stress, or even just the everyday wear and tear of life?
Exactly. And that's why this study is so fascinating. It opens up a whole new avenue of exploration into how we protect our brains from these potential threats. What if we could identify those who are most vulnerable to these brain changes after an infection and intervene early?
That would be amazing. But we're not just sitting ducks, are we? I mean, are there things we can be doing now to mitigate those risks?
There's definitely a lot of interest in lifestyle factors that can help, things like regular exercise, eating a diet rich in antioxidants, getting enough sleep, and managing stress, all play a role in reducing inflammation and supporting brain health.
So while we wait for more answers from the research, there are still things we can do to take control of our brain health. That's a relief to hear. I also wanted to circle back to something in the article. It mentioned that the researchers found subtle changes in brain imaging patterns associated with neurodegeneration in those who had COVID. Can you help me unpack that?
Sure, brain imaging techniques like MRI can sometimes show structural changes in the brain that are hallmarks of neurodegenerative diseases. What's interesting is that in the study, they saw some of those changes in individuals who had COVID, even if they weren't yet experiencing cognitive problems.
So even if people aren't showing outward signs of decline, there could be things happening beneath the surface. That's a little scary.
It does raise concerns about the potential for silent neurodegeneration. More research is definitely needed to understand the long-term implications, but it highlights the importance of early detection.
Absolutely. The sooner we can spot these changes, the better our chances of intervening and slowing down, or even preventing the progression of disease. Are there any promising treatments on the horizon for Alzheimer's? I know there's no cure yet, but is there anything out there that gives you hope?
There's a lot of exciting research going on. One area of focus is on developing drugs that can clear out those amyloid plaques we talked about. Some of these have shown promise in clinical trials, but we still need more research to determine their long-term effectiveness and safety.
So it's a wait-and-see game, but with some reason for optimism.
I think so. We're making progress in understanding the mechanisms of Alzheimer's, and that's leading to new treatment approaches.
That's encouraging to hear. It all points back to the need for continued research.
And it's not just about the researchers. Public awareness is vital. The more people who are informed and engaged in this conversation, the more support we can rally for research efforts.
I couldn't agree more. This study, while potentially concerning, is also a catalyst for greater understanding of the link between infections and brain health. It's like a wake-up call.
Exactly. It urges us to pay attention and take proactive steps to protect our brains. And speaking of knowledge, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've gone from the specific findings of this study to the broader implications for brain health and the future of research.
It's been a fascinating deep dive, and I bet our listeners are feeling a lot more informed about this topic, even if it sparked a few anxieties along the way.
It's always better to be informed and engaged than to be in the dark. We've touched on so many angles, from the study itself to the bigger questions about brain health and what the future holds for research in this area.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, is there one big takeaway you'd want our listeners to remember?
I think the most important thing to remember is that while this research is concerning, it's not a reason to panic. It's a call to action.
I love that framing actionable knowledge is what we're all about here at the deep dive. So what specific actions can our listeners take based on what we've talked about today?
Prioritizing your overall health and well-being is key. That means taking steps to reduce your risk of infection, managing any chronic health conditions, and adopting a brain-healthy lifestyle.
All things that are within our control. It's good to be reminded that we're not powerless in the face of these challenges.
And don't underestimate the power of staying informed. Keep learning, support research efforts, and advocate for policies that prioritize brain health.
Well said. This research has opened up a fascinating new frontier in understanding the brain. It reminds us that we're still in the early stages of unraveling the mysteries of neurodegenerative diseases.
Absolutely, and who knows what breakthroughs are just around the corner. I'm optimistic that with continued research innovation and a collective commitment to brain health, we can make significant strides in preventing and treating these conditions.
That's a great note to end on, a blend of healthy caution and genuine hope. It's easy to get overwhelmed by the complexities of brain health, but it sounds like we're making progress, even if there's still a long way to go.
Absolutely. And the more we understand about these conditions, the better equipped we'll be to face them head on.
Speaking of facing things head on, I'm curious about something. We've talked about COVID and these amyloid biomarkers,
Right.
but we haven't really touched on what folks can actually do if they're concerned about their own brain health, especially after having had COVID. Is it just a matter of watching and waiting?
That's a great question, and I think it's important to emphasize that this research, while significant, doesn't mean everyone who's had COVID is destined to develop Alzheimer's.
Right.
It's about understanding potential risks and taking proactive steps.
Okay, so what would you say to someone listening right now who's thinking, oh man, I had COVID, should I be freaking out?
I would say first, take a deep breath. Freaking out doesn't help anyone.
Right.
Second, talk to your doctor. They can help assess your individual risk factors and advise you on appropriate steps.
So it's not a DIY situation, get a professional opinion.
Exactly. And beyond that, focus on the things we've already talked about, those lifestyle factors that support brain health.
Right.
Eating a balanced diet, getting regular exercise, managing stress. These aren't just good for your body, they're good for your brain too.
So even if there's not a magic bullet, there's a lot we can do to stack the deck in our favor.
Exactly. And remember, knowledge is power. The more you understand about your own health, the more empowered you'll be to make informed decisions.
Well said. This deep dive has been a whirlwind of information, and I know our listeners are walking away with a lot to think about.
It's been a pleasure discussing this with you. I always appreciate the opportunity to explore these complex topics and hopefully shed some light on them for our listeners.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little bit inspiring. Remember, even in the face of challenges like potential brain health risks, there's always something we can do. Stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay proactive about your health.
And who knows, maybe one of our listeners will be the one to make the next big breakthrough in this field.
That would be amazing.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing, folks. This is The Deep Dive signing off.